The static crackled through the emergency radio like the dying breath of civilization itself. Kestrel Donovan pressed her ear closer to the device, her calloused fingers adjusting the frequency dial with practiced precision. In the basement of what had once been Millfield's public library, the familiar smell of mold and decay mingled with the acrid scent of fear that had become her constant companion. "This is Sanctuary Base calling any survivors in the northeastern corridor," the voice emerged from the white noise, barely audible above the interference. "We are located in the Adirondack Mountains, coordinates 37-42-15 north, 74-12-8 west. We have medical supplies, food, and secure perimeter. Repeat, this is Sanctuary Base." The transmission dissolved back into static, leaving Kestrel staring at the radio as if willing it to speak again. Above her, the floorboards creaked with the shuffling gait she had learned to recognize immediately: the infected. They never stopped moving, never stopped searching for the living. After 18 months of this nightmare, she could distinguish between the fresh ones that still retained some coordination and the rotting husks that moved purely on primal hunger. Zephyr Blackwood emerged from the shadows behind the overturned reference desk, his crossbow loaded and ready. At 19, he had aged decades since the outbreak began, his once bright eyes now carrying the weight of too many losses. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw served as a permanent reminder of their escape from the Atlanta quarantine zone, where they had watched the military's final stand crumble into chaos. "How many up there?" Kestrel whispered, not bothering to look up from the radio. She was already calculating distances, supply requirements, and the impossible odds they would face trying to reach the Adirondacks. 6, maybe 7. They're following the blood trail from yesterday. Zephyr's voice carried the flat tone of someone who had learned to compartmentalize horror. "Onyx is covering the back exit, but we can't stay here much longer." Onyx Reeves appeared at the basement entrance, her medical bag slung across her shoulder and exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Once a trauma surgeon at Johns Hopkins, she now served as both healer and executioner for their small group. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that the woman who had sworn to do no harm had become their most efficient killer. "Riven's fever broke, but he needs real antibiotics soon," she reported, wiping blood from a fresh cut on her knuckles. "That infection is going to kill him faster than any zombie if we don't find proper medical supplies." In the corner, Riven Castellanos lay wrapped in a salvaged sleeping bag, his olive complexion pale and slick with sweat. The former Marine had taken shrapnel during their escape from the Providence safe zone 3 weeks ago, and despite Onyx's best efforts with scavenged supplies, infection had set in. Every labored breath reminded them all of their mortality in this new world. Ember Valdez kept watch from the small basement window, her sniper rifle trained on the street above. At 26, she had been a competitive marksman before the world ended, a skill that had kept them alive through countless encounters. Her copper hair was pulled back in a severe braid, and her green eyes never stopped scanning for threats. She raised 2 fingers without turning around, their silent signal for increased activity outside. "They're getting more aggressive," Ember murmured. "Something's got them stirred up. Could be the storm last night, could be something else moving through the area." Atlas Montgomery lowered himself carefully down the ladder from the main floor, his engineer's mind constantly working even in their desperate circumstances. The tall, lanky man had kept their vehicles running, their weapons functional, and their electronics working through resourcefulness and stubborn determination. His latest project, a modified EMP device he'd been working on for weeks, hung from his belt in a jury-rigged harness. The radio signal was clean, he said, joining their impromptu strategy session. No interference patterns that would suggest a trap. "The coordinates check out too. There's an old research station up there that would make sense for a survivor enclave." Indigo Santos, barely 16 but hardened by loss that would have broken adults, sat beside Riven monitoring his vital signs with the diligence of someone who had lost too many people already. Her dark hair fell across her face as she checked his pulse, hiding the tears that threatened whenever she thought about losing another member of their makeshift family. "We can't make that journey with Riven in this condition," Onyx stated flatly. "It's over 200 miles through infected territory and winter's coming. Even if we find a vehicle that runs, the roads are blocked or destroyed. We'd be walking most of the way." Kestrel finally looked up from the radio, her gray eyes reflecting the terrible weight of leadership she had never asked for. Outside, the shuffling footsteps grew louder, joined by the distinctive moan that meant the infected had caught their scent. Time was running out, and decisions that would determine who lived and who died could no longer be postponed. The choice between safety and loyalty would test everything they believed about humanity's future. The first infected body hit the library's main floor with a wet thud that echoed through the building like a death knell. Kestrel's hand instinctively moved to the modified Glock at her hip, a weapon that had saved her life more times than she cared to count. The irony of hiding in a place once dedicated to preserving human knowledge while humanity itself teetered on the edge of extinction wasn't lost on her. "We have maybe 20 minutes before they break through the barricades," Atlas whispered, his fingers already working on the portable radio equipment. "I can rig a delayed transmission to broadcast that emergency signal on repeat. Might draw them away from our actual escape route." Zephyr moved to Riven's side, assessing their wounded companion with the clinical detachment of a soldier. The fever had broken, but the Marine's breathing remained shallow and labored. Moving him would be agony, leaving him would be murder. These were the calculations that haunted Kestrel's dreams, when she was lucky enough to sleep at all. "I can walk," Riven rasped, attempting to sit up despite Indigo's protests. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandages covering his torso, a crimson reminder of their failed attempt to reach the CDC facility in Georgia. "Don't even think about leaving me behind." "Nobody's leaving anyone," Kestrel said with more conviction than she felt. "Atlas, how long to modify that radio?" "Ember, what's our best exit strategy?" Ember shifted position at the window, her rifle tracking movement in the street above. "North side's clear for now, but that won't last. There's a storm drain about 50 yards out that connects to the old subway tunnel system. Problem is, we'd be underground for at least 6 hours before reaching clean territory." "The tunnels haven't been cleared," Onyx pointed out, her medical training making her acutely aware of infection vectors and contamination risks. "We could be walking into a nest of infected, or worse, survivors who've gone feral." The distinction between infected and feral survivors had become increasingly blurred as resources dwindled and desperation grew. Kestrel had seen communities turn cannibalistic, watched children taught to kill without hesitation, witnessed the complete breakdown of the social contracts that had once defined civilization. Sometimes she wondered if the infected were the lucky ones, at least their suffering had an endpoint. Atlas worked with practiced efficiency, rewiring circuits and adjusting frequencies with tools salvaged from a dozen different sources. "I can have this ready in 10 minutes. The broadcast will loop for about 6 hours before the battery dies. Should be enough to draw them east while we head north." Indigo helped Riven to his feet, the teenager's small frame supporting more weight than should have been possible. Her parents had been researchers at the CDC when the first outbreaks occurred. She had learned about viral mutations and transmission vectors before she learned algebra, and that knowledge had kept them alive on more than one occasion. "The sanctuary base signal mentioned medical supplies," she said quietly. "If they have antibiotics we could save him. But if we stay here..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Above them, the sounds of destruction grew louder. Books crashed to the floor, shelving units toppled, and the distinctive sound of breaking glass signaled that their barricades wouldn't hold much longer. Ember's rifle cracked once, then twice, buying them precious minutes as infected bodies dropped in the street. 2 minutes, Atlas announced, sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill. "I've got the signal locked and the delay sequence programmed." Kestrel made the decision that would haunt her regardless of the outcome. "We move together. Atlas, trigger your distraction and then destroy anything that could be used to track us. Ember, you take point. Onyx and Indigo help with Riven. Zephyr, rear guard." "What about supplies?" Zephyr asked, shouldering his pack and checking his crossbow bolts. "We take what we can carry, leave everything else." Kestrel's voice carried the flat authority of someone who had learned that sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. 200 miles to Sanctuary, assuming it actually exists. We travel light, travel fast, and pray we're not walking into another trap." The ceiling above them groaned ominously as infected bodies pressed against the weakening barricades. Soon, the weight of sheer numbers would bring the entire structure down. They had survived this long by staying mobile, never remaining in one place long enough for large groups of infected to gather. But Riven's injury had forced them to hole up for 3 weeks, and now the consequences of that decision were literally bearing down on them. Atlas triggered the delayed transmission device and immediately began smashing the remaining equipment with a crowbar. "Done. Signal will start broadcasting in 90 seconds and repeat for 6 hours. That should draw most of them east toward the industrial district." Ember slung her rifle and moved toward the back exit, her movements fluid and silent. Years of hunting before the outbreak had given her skills that translated perfectly to their new reality. "Exit's clear, but I can see movement 3 blocks north. We'll have a window, but not a big one." Kestrel took one last look around the basement that had sheltered them for 3 weeks. Scattered among their abandoned supplies were the personal effects they couldn't carry: photographs of lost loved ones, letters never sent, small mementos of the world that no longer existed. Each item represented someone who had trusted her to keep them alive, and each loss accumulated like stones in her chest. "Move out," she ordered, pushing down the familiar weight of responsibility that threatened to crush her. Outside, the countdown to their next test of survival had already begun. The storm drain reeked of decay and stagnant water, but it was the smell of the living that made Kestrel's skin crawl. Fresh blood and human waste mixed with the metallic tang of fear. Someone had been here recently and they hadn't left willingly. Ember moved ahead with her rifle ready, using hand signals to communicate dangers that words might betray to lurking threats. The tunnel system beneath Millfield had been designed for flood control, not human passage. The concrete passages barely provided enough headroom for Atlas, and the ankle-deep water soaked through their boots within minutes. Behind them, the sound of the radio distraction echoed through the city streets, drawing infected away from their escape route with the promise of fresh prey. Riven leaned heavily on Indigo, each step sending spikes of pain through his wounded torso. Sweat mixed with rainwater on his face, and his breathing had become increasingly labored as they descended deeper into the drainage system. Onyx checked his pulse whenever they paused, her expression growing more concerned with each assessment. "We need to find somewhere to rest," she whispered to Kestrel during one of their brief stops. "His heart rate is elevated and I think the infection is spreading. Without proper antibiotics, we're looking at sepsis within 48 hours. Kestrel nodded grimly, her flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead. The beam revealed graffiti on the walls, some predating the outbreak, but others were fresh warnings scrawled in what looked suspiciously like dried blood. "Death ahead," and "Turn back," competed for space with crude maps and desperate messages from previous travelers. Atlas consulted his modified GPS unit, a device he had rigged to work off satellite data even when the regular networks had failed. "We're about 2 miles from the old subway junction. From there we can access the maintenance tunnels that run north toward the state forest. Should put us within striking distance of the coordinates by tomorrow night. Assuming we don't run into whatever left those messages," Zephyr muttered, his crossbow trained on the shadows ahead. The young man had developed an almost supernatural awareness of danger, a survival instinct honed by months of near-death encounters. The tunnel branched ahead, and Ember raised her fist to signal a halt. Her enhanced senses had detected something the others missed, a sound that didn't belong in the steady drip and echo of the drainage system. Voices, low and urgent, coming from the left passage. Kestrel motioned for silence and crept forward to join Ember at the junction. Through the darkness, she could make out flickering candlelight and the silhouettes of at least 4 people huddled around what appeared to be a makeshift camp. Their voices carried the desperate edge of people pushed beyond their limits. "Saw them go into the library," a woman's voice said. "Had weapons, looked organized. Maybe they have supplies we can take." "I don't like it," replied a man with the gravelly tone of a longtime smoker. "Last group we tried to rob fought back. Lost Martinez and Cooper for a handful of canned beans." Ember looked back at Kestrel with raised eyebrows. These weren't infected, they were survivors who had turned to preying on other survivors. In some ways they were more dangerous than the zombies. The infected killed to feed, these people killed for profit. A third voice joined the conversation, younger and more volatile. "We can't keep living like this. I say we take whatever they have and then clear out of this area entirely. Head south where the weather's better." "Winter's coming fast," the woman agreed. "But I heard something on the radio earlier. Some place called Sanctuary Base up in the mountains. Claims they have food and medicine." Kestrel's blood ran cold. These people had heard the same transmission, and they were planning to follow the same route. But their version of reaching Sanctuary involved robbing and possibly killing anyone they encountered along the way. She retreated carefully to where the others waited, her mind already working through their limited options. They could try to bypass this group entirely by taking the right passage, but that would add hours to their journey through unknown territory. They could wait for the scavengers to move on, but Riven needed medical attention that couldn't wait. Or they could confront the threat directly, 7 armed survivors against 4 desperate scavengers. "What's the call?" Zephyr whispered, reading the situation in Kestrel's expression. Before she could answer, a new sound echoed through the tunnels, the distinctive moan of infected, amplified and distorted by the concrete passages. The radio distraction had worked too well, drawing not just the infected from the library but apparently stirring up others that had been dormant in the tunnel system. "Multiple contacts coming from behind us," Atlas reported quietly, his modified motion detector painting red blips on its small screen. At least a dozen, maybe more. They're moving fast. The scavengers in the side passage had heard it too. Their voices became urgent, panicked, as they realized they were about to be trapped between the infected and whoever might be in the main tunnel. Candlelight flickered frantically as they gathered their belongings, preparing to run. Ember raised her rifle, waiting for orders. Indigo pulled Riven closer to the wall, trying to make him as invisible as possible in the shadows. Onyx checked her pistol and the few medical supplies she carried, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether any of them lived to see morning. The sound of shuffling feet and inhuman moans grew louder, echoing off the tunnel walls like the approach of an underground avalanche. In the distance, screams began as the infected reached other survivors who hadn't been as fortunate or prepared. Kestrel realized that their survival now depended on an alliance with people who had been planning to rob them. The enemy of my enemy, she thought grimly, might be the only chance any of them had of reaching the surface alive. We need to work together, she called out to the scavengers, loud enough to be heard over the approaching chaos. Help us fight and we'll all get out of here alive. The response came in the form of muzzle flashes and the sharp crack of gunfire as the scavengers opened fire, not at the infected but at Kestrel's group. Bullets ricocheted off the concrete walls, sending sparks and stone fragments flying in the confined space. Ember dropped to one knee and returned fire with practiced precision, her first shot taking down the gravelly-voiced man before he could reload. So much for diplomacy, Zephyr muttered, pressing himself against the tunnel wall as another volley of bullets whined overhead. The infected moans were getting closer, and now they had gunfire drawing every zombie in the area directly toward their position. Atlas yanked a device from his belt, a modified flashbang grenade he had cobbled together from road flares and electronic components. Cover your eyes, he shouted, pulling the pin and hurling it toward the scavenger's position. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, and the brilliant white light temporarily blinded everyone in the tunnel. In the chaotic aftermath, Kestrel heard the woman scavenger screaming orders to retreat, followed by the sound of running feet splashing through the standing water. The younger voice she had heard earlier cried out in pain. Ember's second shot had found its mark. Infected, 30 seconds out, Onyx reported, helping Riven stay upright while monitoring the tunnel behind them. Her medical training included battlefield triage, and she could hear the difference between human distress and the relentless approach of the undead. The first zombie appeared at the edge of their flashlight beams, a former construction worker still wearing his hard hat and safety vest, both now splattered with dried blood and worse. His jaw hung at an unnatural angle, and one arm ended in exposed bone where something had chewed through the flesh. Ember's rifle spoke again, the .308 round taking the infected man's head clean off. But behind him came more, men, women, even children, all in various stages of decay. Some were recent infections, still coordinated enough to move quickly. Others were ancient by post-outbreak standards, shambling horrors held together by dried sinew and viral hunger. Move now, Kestrel ordered, making the tactical decision to advance through the scavenger's position rather than face the growing horde in a tunnel with no escape route. They pushed forward into the side passage where their attackers had been camped. The scene that greeted them was a testament to desperation and moral collapse. The scavengers had been living off supplies looted from other survivors, backpacks still bearing the names of their previous owners, family photographs scattered among ammunition and canned goods, children's toys mixed with weapons and drugs. One corner held a pile of driver's licenses and identification cards, grim trophies of the people these scavengers had robbed and killed. Indigo stared at the collection in horror. These are from the Mason family, she whispered, holding up a photo of parents with 2 young children. They were traveling with us 3 months ago. Said they were heading to the coast to find a boat. They never made it, Zephyr said grimly, checking the bodies of the 2 scavengers Ember had killed. The woman and the younger man had escaped into the deeper tunnels, but they had left behind most of their supplies in their panic to flee. Atlas worked frantically to seal the entrance they had come through, using debris and a small explosive charge to collapse part of the tunnel roof. The sound of infected bodies pressing against the obstruction was immediate and terrifying, but his improvised barrier would hold, at least temporarily. We've got maybe an hour before they find another way around, he reported, sweat streaming down his face despite the underground chill. This whole tunnel system is connected. We need to be long gone before they figure out the alternate routes. Riven had collapsed against one of the tunnel walls, his face gray and his breathing shallow. Onyx knelt beside him, checking his pulse and examining the infected wound that was slowly killing him. Her expression when she looked up at Kestrel confirmed what they all feared. "He needs surgery and intravenous antibiotics within the next 12 hours, she said quietly. "The infection has spread to his bloodstream. Even if we reach this sanctuary base, I'm not sure." "I can hear you," Riven interrupted weakly. "And I'm not dead yet. Help me up. We keep moving." Ember had found something among the scavengers' supplies that made her face go pale. She held up a military radio, its government markings still visible despite its battered condition. Static crackled from the speaker, and occasionally fragments of voice communications broke through the interference. "Sector 7 is compromised. Repeat, Sector 7 is lost. Civilian evacuation route Beta is blocked. Recommend alternate. Nuclear option is still on the table if containment fails. Military still active," Atlas said, taking the radio and adjusting its frequency controls. "If we can make contact, maybe they can provide air support or medical evacuation for Riven. Or they'll consider us infected and bomb our position," Kestrel pointed out. The military's track record for protecting civilians hasn't been exactly stellar during this crisis. The sound of voices echoed from deeper in the tunnel system. The two surviving scavengers had regrouped and were calling back toward their former position. Their words were muffled by distance and acoustic distortion, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. "They're coming back with friends," Ember observed, shouldering her rifle and checking her remaining ammunition. "We need to move before this becomes a three-way battle in a confined space." Kestrel made another command decision that would ripple forward into an uncertain future. They would take the scavengers' supplies, including the military radio, and push deeper into the tunnel system toward the subway junction. Behind them, the infected were finding new routes through the drainage network. Ahead, hostile survivors were gathering for a counterattack. And somewhere above, the radio distraction that had initially saved them was drawing more infected into the area. The next few hours would determine whether their desperate gamble to reach Sanctuary Base was an act of hope or a march toward inevitable death in the darkness beneath a dead city. The subway junction opened into a vast underground chamber that had once been the pride of Millfield's public transportation system. Now it served as a tomb for dozens of commuters who had sought shelter here during the initial outbreak. Their bodies, still dressed in business suits and casual wear, lay scattered across the platform where they had died 18 months ago. Some from infection, others from violence, and many from simple starvation when rescue never came. Ember moved through the corpses with professional detachment, checking sight lines and defensive positions. The platform offered multiple exit routes but also multiple entry points for threats. Ancient fluorescent lights flickered sporadically overhead, casting dancing shadows that made every motionless body look like it might suddenly lurch to life. Atlas set up his equipment in what had been the station master's office, its reinforced walls providing some protection while he worked to establish communications. The military radio crackled with intermittent chatter, most of it coded transmissions that revealed more about the scope of the ongoing crisis than they wanted to know. "Government's fractured," he reported, listening to the traffic with growing concern. "Sounds like different military units are operating independently now. Some are still trying to protect civilian populations, others have gone full containment mode, shoot on sight, no exceptions." Riven had managed the descent to the platform, but the effort had cost him dearly. Blood seeped through his bandages more freely now, and his skin had taken on the waxy pallor that Onyx recognized as early shock. She worked with their limited medical supplies, knowing that everything she did was merely delaying the inevitable without proper surgical intervention. "The infections reached his lymphatic system," she told Kestrel privately. "I can see the red streaking under his skin. We're looking at systemic sepsis, probably organ failure within 24 hours. He needs a full surgical team and antibiotics that we just don't have." Indigo sat beside Riven, holding his hand and humming softly, a lullaby her mother had sung to her before the world ended. At 16 she had already watched too many people die, but Riven was different. He had protected her when others might have seen her as a burden, taught her skills that kept her alive, and treated her like the daughter he had lost in the Atlanta Purge. "Remember when you taught me to read tactical maps?" she whispered to him. "You said that knowledge was the only weapon they couldn't take away from us." Riven managed a weak smile. "Still true, little one. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnels, multiple people moving with military precision rather than the chaotic shuffle of the infected. Zephyr positioned himself behind a concrete pillar with his crossbow ready, while Ember found an elevated position on the mezzanine level that would give her clear shots at multiple approach routes. 8 contacts, armed, moving in formation, Ember reported through their hand signal system. These aren't scavengers or infected. Professional military or law enforcement. The lead figure emerged into the platform lighting wearing the tattered remains of a National Guard uniform. Staff Sergeant Maria Vasquez had been leading her unit through the underground tunnels for weeks, searching for civilian survivors while avoiding the increasingly paranoid orders coming from higher command. Federal Emergency Management Authority, she called out, her rifle trained on their position but not immediately threatening. We're conducting search and rescue operations in this sector. Identify yourselves and state your condition. Kestrel made the decision to reveal their position, stepping into the open with her hands visible but ready to move. 7 civilians, 1 requiring immediate medical attention. We're trying to reach a reported safe zone in the Adirondacks. The mountain facility? Vasquez lowered her weapon slightly. We've heard the transmissions too. Most of my unit thinks it's either a trap or wishful thinking. The entire northeastern corridor is considered lost territory now. Behind Vasquez, 6 other soldiers emerged from the tunnels. They looked as haggard and desperate as any civilian survivors, their equipment cobbled together from multiple sources and their eyes carrying the hollow stare of people who had seen too much death. We've been ordered to establish a containment perimeter around the major population centers, Vasquez continued. Shoot any civilian attempting to cross the line, infected or not. The brass figures it's better to sacrifice a few uninfected than risk spreading the outbreak further. And you're not following those orders? Zephyr observed, reading the conflict in the sergeant's expression. My oath was to protect American citizens, not execute them for the crime of being refugees in their own country. Vasquez's jaw tightened. But that puts us in a difficult position. Officially we're deserters. If other military units find us helping civilians. The conversation was interrupted by the distinctive sound of vehicles approaching through the upper streets, heavy engines and the squealing of tires on broken asphalt. Atlas's motion detectors began painting red contacts across their screens as dozens of heat signatures converged on the subway entrance. Movement topside, Atlas reported urgently. Multiple vehicles, looks like a full military convoy. They're setting up a perimeter around this entire block. Vasquez cursed under her breath. That'll be Colonel Morrison's unit. He's been tracking deserters for the past month, bringing them back for court-martial and execution. If they find us down here with civilians? How many ways out of this station? Kestrel asked, her tactical mind already working through their dwindling options. 3 main exits, but they'll have those covered within minutes, Vasquez replied. There's an old maintenance tunnel that connects to the storm water system, but it's been sealed with concrete barriers. Would take heavy explosives to break through. Atlas hefted his improvised devices. I've got enough ordnance to breach a concrete wall, but the explosion will bring the whole tunnel system down on our heads. We'd have maybe 60 seconds to get through before the ceiling collapses. Above them, the sound of vehicles had stopped, replaced by the organized movement of boots on pavement and the sharp commands of a military unit establishing tactical positions. Flashlight beams began probing the subway entrances, and the squawk of military radios echoed down the concrete stairwells. Ember checked her ammunition count and found it disturbingly low. I've got 12 rounds left for the rifle, maybe 30 for the pistol. Against a full military unit with body armor and automatic weapons, that won't last long. Riven struggled to sit up, his face determined despite his deteriorating condition. Give me a weapon, he said quietly. If we're making a last stand, I'm not dying on my back. The moment of decision had arrived. Fight their way out against overwhelming odds, surrender to a military unit that might execute them on sight, or risk everything on Atlas's explosive gamble with a tunnel that might not even lead to safety. Time was running out, and the sound of approaching boots grew louder with each passing second. The first military patrol descended into the subway station with tactical precision, their night vision goggles sweeping the platform in coordinated arcs. Colonel Morrison's voice echoed through their radio communications, cold and methodical as he directed the search pattern that would inevitably lead to their discovery. Atlas worked frantically with his explosive devices, calculating blast patterns and structural weak points while trying to remain silent. The concrete barrier that sealed the maintenance tunnel was 3 feet thick and reinforced with steel. Breaking through would require most of his remaining ordnance and create enough noise to alert every military unit within a mile radius. 30 seconds to breach, he whispered, sweat dripping despite the underground chill. But once I light this fuse, there's no going back. The explosion will bring down half this platform. Vasquez positioned her soldiers to cover the main entrances, knowing they were vastly outnumbered but unwilling to abandon the civilians they had sworn to protect. Her radio crackled with Morrison's increasingly impatient demands for status reports from the search teams, each transmission bringing discovery closer. Sector 7 clear, moving to platform level, came the report from above. Boot steps echoed down the stairwell, accompanied by the mechanical whine of night vision equipment and the metallic click of weapons being readied for use. Ember had found a sniper's perch behind the ticket booth, her rifle trained on the main entrance. At this range, even with limited ammunition, she could drop several soldiers before they realized where the shots were coming from. But that would only buy them minutes, and the price would be measured in lives. Riven had insisted on being given a pistol despite his condition, positioning himself to cover their retreat route even though everyone knew he lacked the strength to be effective in combat. His presence was more symbolic than tactical, a reminder that they would face whatever came together as they had for the past 18 months. Contact, came the whispered warning from one of Vasquez's soldiers. Lead element is on the platform. 6 hostiles in full combat gear, moving toward the eastern section. The flashlight beams were getting closer, probing the shadows where bodies lay scattered among the debris. In minutes, they would reach the station master's office where Atlas worked to prepare their escape route. Discovery was inevitable unless they acted immediately. Kestrel made the signal and Atlas triggered his charges. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, sending shock waves through the concrete structure and raining debris from the ceiling. Emergency lighting flickered and died, plunging the platform into chaotic darkness broken only by muzzle flashes as the search teams opened fire blindly toward the source of the blast. Go, go, go! Vasquez shouted over the ringing in their ears, her soldiers laying down covering fire while the civilians pushed through the newly created breach in the maintenance tunnel wall. The opening was barely wide enough for a single person, and smoking concrete chunks continued to fall as the structure groaned ominously overhead. Ember squeezed off her remaining rifle rounds in rapid succession, each shot carefully placed to force the military team into cover rather than attempt to stop their escape. Her final bullet took down the sergeant leading the search patrol, buying them precious additional seconds as the remaining soldiers regrouped. Indigo helped drag Riven through the breach, his weight almost too much for her slight frame. Blood streamed from his reopened wounds, leaving a trail that would make them easy to track if anyone survived to follow. Onyx crawled through after them, her medical bag catching on the jagged concrete edges. Atlas and Zephyr worked together to position the last of their explosives as a delayed trap, setting timers that would collapse this section of tunnel after they had escaped but before pursuit could follow. The mathematics were brutal. They had perhaps 2 minutes before the charges detonated, sealing their escape route but also potentially trapping them in an unexplored section of the underground system. Vasquez, move! Kestrel shouted as rifle fire erupted from multiple directions. Morrison's reinforcements had arrived, flooding the platform with soldiers who showed no hesitation about firing into the darkness where their own men might be positioned. The sergeant pushed the last of her soldiers through the breach and turned back to provide final covering fire. Her M4 carbine chattered in short, controlled bursts until the magazine ran dry. As she reached for a fresh clip, a sniper's bullet from the platform above caught her in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her weapon clattering across the concrete. "Leave me," she gasped, blood flowing freely from the wound. "Seal the tunnel and get these people to safety." "That's an order." But Zephyr was already moving, dragging the wounded sergeant toward the breach despite her protests. Atlas's timer showed 45 seconds remaining as they squeezed through the opening together, emerging into a narrow maintenance tunnel that stretched away into absolute darkness. Behind them, the delayed charges detonated with earth-shaking force. The explosion brought down tons of concrete and steel, sealing the breach and crushing at least 3 of Morrison's soldiers who had been attempting to follow. The sound of their deaths was lost in the grinding collapse of the tunnel structure. They ran through the darkness with only Atlas's modified flashlight to guide them, stumbling over pipes and debris while the sound of secondary explosions echoed behind them. The maintenance tunnel had been abandoned for decades, and the air was thick with decades of accumulated dust and decay. Riven collapsed after 50 yards, his strength finally exhausted. Blood pooled beneath him as Onyx worked to slow the hemorrhaging, knowing that their violent escape had accelerated his decline toward systemic shock. They were free of immediate pursuit, but at a cost that might ultimately prove higher than capture. "How far to the surface?" Kestrel asked Atlas, who was consulting his modified GPS and trying to determine their position relative to the coordinates they were seeking. 2 miles through these tunnels to reach the old railway corridor, he replied. From there, maybe 8 hours of hard walking to reach the foothills where the sanctuary base signal originated. 8 hours that Riven didn't have, through territory they had never scouted, toward a destination that might not even exist. They had burned their bridges, literally and figuratively, in pursuit of a hope that grew more fragile with each passing minute. But behind them lay only death, and ahead lay the possibility of sanctuary. Dawn broke over the Adirondack foothills like a promise unfulfilled, painting the autumn landscape in shades of gold and crimson that mocked their desperate circumstances. They had emerged from the maintenance tunnels near an abandoned railway yard, where rusted freight cars stood like tombstones marking the death of a civilization that had once moved mountains with its industry and ambition. Riven was dying. There was no point in pretending otherwise anymore. Onyx had done everything possible with their limited supplies, but the infection had spread too far and too fast. His breathing came in shallow gasps, and his skin had taken on the grayish pallor that preceded systematic organ failure. Each step they took toward the coordinates was another step closer to losing him. Vasquez's shoulder wound had been cleaned and bandaged, but she was operating on pain medication scavenged from the military patrol they had escaped. Her remaining soldiers, Corporal James Mitchell, Private First Class Sarah Chin, and Specialist David Kowalski, formed a protective perimeter around the group as they moved through terrain that offered too many opportunities for ambush. Radio chatter's been quiet for the past hour, Atlas reported, monitoring both their salvaged military radio and his jury-rigged equipment. Either Morrison's unit is maintaining communication silence, or they've given up the pursuit. Could be they think we died in the tunnel collapse. Ember scouted ahead through dense forest that showed disturbing signs of recent violence. Trees bore scars from gunfire, and she found the remains of at least 2 campsites that had been attacked and looted. Whoever had established the sanctuary base was either very good at defending their territory, or the facility itself was a trap designed to lure desperate survivors into an ambush. Movement ahead, she signaled back to the group. Single individual appears to be injured and alone. Could be genuine, could be bait. The figure that emerged from behind a stand of pine trees was a woman in her 50s, wearing civilian clothes that were torn and blood-stained. She moved with the careful gait of someone nursing injuries, and her eyes held the 1,000-yard stare that came from witnessing too much horror. "Please," she called out when she saw them. "Don't shoot. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Warren, and I've been trying to reach the mountain facility for 6 days. My research team was attacked by raiders near Lake Placid. I'm the only one who made it out." Kestrel approached cautiously, noting the woman's hands and checking for weapons or signs of infection. The doctor's story seemed genuine, but they had learned to trust no one completely in this new world where deception was often the difference between survival and death. "What kind of research?" Onyx asked, her medical training making her naturally suspicious of anyone claiming scientific credentials. "Viral epidemiology and vaccine development," Warren replied. "I was part of the team working on a treatment protocol at the CDC facility in Albany before it was overrun. We've been trying to establish communication with any remaining government research programs." Atlas examined the documents Warren carried, research notes and data files that appeared authentic, along with identification that matched her story. If she was telling the truth, she might be the key to developing a cure for the infection that had destroyed civilization. "The sanctuary base," Warren continued, "it's real. My team made contact with them 8 days ago. They have a functioning laboratory and claim to have made significant progress on understanding the viral mechanism. But the approach routes are heavily contested. Raiders, infected, and military units that consider any civilian movement to be a contamination risk." Riven managed to speak, though the effort clearly cost him dearly. How far?" 6 miles through the forest to reach the perimeter," Warren replied, looking at his condition with the trained eye of someone familiar with trauma medicine. "But they have medical facilities. Real equipment, not field expedients. If we can get him there." It was a hope too fragile to voice directly, but it hung in the air between them like a lifeline thrown to drowning swimmers. 6 miles through hostile territory, carrying a man who might not survive another hour, toward a destination that might be able to save him if they could reach it in time. "We need to move fast," Kestrel decided. "Atlas, can you rig a travois from material here in the rail yard? Something to carry Riven without slowing us down too much?" "Give me 20 minutes, Atlas replied, already examining the wreckage around them for suitable components. His engineer's mind was cataloging materials and calculating weight distributions even as he spoke. Indigo knelt beside Riven, checking his pulse and noting how weak it had become. "You're going to make it," she told him with fierce determination. "We didn't come this far just to lose you now." "Little one," Riven whispered, "if I don't, promise me you'll keep learning? Knowledge is power and power is survival. You'll teach me yourself, she replied stubbornly. We're going to reach that facility, they're going to fix you up, and you're going to complain about my tactical assessments for years to come. Dr. Warren approached Onyx with a small vial containing clear liquid. This is morphine from my emergency kit, she said quietly. It won't cure the infection, but it might give him enough pain relief to survive the journey. As Atlas worked to construct an improvised stretcher from railway debris and salvaged materials, the sound of helicopter rotors echoed in the distance. The aircraft was too far away to identify, but it served as a reminder that they were not alone in these mountains, and not everyone they might encounter would be friendly. The final phase of their journey towards Sanctuary was about to begin, and none of them knew whether they were walking towards salvation or into the jaws of an elaborate trap. The Sanctuary base perimeter appeared through the morning mist like something from a fever dream. Concentric rings of razor wire, motion sensors, and automated defensive positions carved into the mountainside. Guard towers made from reinforced concrete rose at strategic intervals, their occupants watching the approaching group through military-grade optics that could distinguish between the living and the infected at distances measured in miles. Dr. Warren had been right about the facility's existence, but she had understated its scale. This wasn't a simple survivor enclave, it was a full military installation that had been expanded and reinforced since the outbreak began. Solar panels and wind generators dotted the mountainside, providing the power necessary to maintain the electronic barriers that kept the infected at bay. Approaching survivors, halt and identify yourselves, came the amplified voice from the nearest guard tower. Submit to decontamination and medical screening before proceeding to the entrance checkpoint. Kestrel raised her hands in the universal gesture of surrender, acutely aware that rifle scopes were tracking every member of their group. Atlas's improvised travois had worked better than expected, allowing them to transport Riven through the forest without stopping, but the Marine's condition had continued to deteriorate. His breathing was so shallow now that Indigo had to place her ear against his chest to confirm he was still alive. 7 survivors plus 3 military personnel requesting emergency medical assistance, Kestrel called back. We have one critical case requiring immediate surgical intervention. The decontamination process was thorough and humiliating, full-body scans, blood tests, and a quarantine period during which armed guards watched them through reinforced glass while technicians analyzed their samples for any trace of infection. It was a reminder that survival in this new world required surrendering the privacy and dignity that had once been taken for granted. Dr. Patricia Holbrook, the facility's chief medical officer, emerged from the quarantine booth with Riven's test results and a grim expression. The infection has spread to his cardiovascular system, she informed them. We can attempt surgery, but the damage may be too extensive for a full recovery. Even if we save his life, he might face permanent disability. Try anyway, Indigo said fiercely. He's family. The medical facility inside Sanctuary Base was indeed impressive. Clean operating rooms with modern equipment, antibiotics and other medications that had become priceless commodities in the outside world, and a staff of doctors and nurses who had somehow maintained their skills and sanity through 18 months of apocalyptic conditions. But as they were led deeper into the facility, disturbing details began to emerge. The survivors they encountered weren't refugees like themselves. They were researchers, military personnel, and government officials who had been selected for admission based on their potential value to the continuity of civilization. Everyone else was considered expendable. The screening process is necessarily rigorous, explained Commander Robert Hayes, the facility's military leader. We simply don't have the resources to accommodate every survivor who makes it this far. Admission is based on skills, genetic factors, and potential contribution to rebuilding efforts. Atlas was immediately taken for debriefing about his engineering modifications and technical innovations. Dr. Warren was escorted to the research laboratories where her viral epidemiology expertise would be put to immediate use. Ember's marksmanship scores and tactical experience earned her a place in the facility's security force. But Vasquez and her soldiers were categorized differently, as deserters whose value was questionable and whose loyalty couldn't be guaranteed. They were assigned to a separate section of the facility, essentially a prison wing where their fate would be determined by committee review. What about us? Kestrel asked, referring to herself, Indigo, and Onyx. That remains to be determined, Hayes replied coldly. Leadership skills are valuable, but we already have a functional command structure. Medical knowledge is always useful, but again our needs are specific. As for the young woman, he studied Indigo with calculating eyes. Her age and genetic profile might qualify her for the breeding program. The words hit Kestrel like a physical blow. This wasn't Sanctuary, It was a eugenics experiment disguised as a survival facility. The people who controlled this place had decided that rebuilding civilization required careful genetic selection and population control, treating human beings like livestock in a breeding program designed to create their vision of a better future. "I want to see Riven," Kestrel demanded. "I'm afraid that's not possible during the surgical procedure," Hayes replied. "But you'll be pleased to know that our surgeons are among the finest in the country. If anyone can save him, they can." The surgery lasted 6 hours. When Dr. Holbrook finally emerged from the operating room, her expression was carefully neutral, the practiced look of someone delivering news that could be interpreted as either good or bad depending on one's perspective. "We were able to remove the infected tissue and repair the immediate damage," she reported. "The patient is stable but will require weeks of recovery and rehabilitation. Full function may never return, but he should survive." Indigo wept with relief, but Kestrel felt a growing sense of unease about the price of that survival. They had reached sanctuary, but at what cost? Their group was being separated, evaluated, and processed according to criteria they had no voice in establishing. Riven would live, but as what? A patient, a prisoner, or something else entirely? That night, as she lay in the sterile quarters assigned to her, Kestrel stared at the ceiling and wondered if they had escaped one nightmare only to find themselves trapped in another. Outside the reinforced windows, the lights of the perimeter defenses cast shadows that danced like the ghosts of everyone they had lost along the way. The radio signal that had drawn them here had promised sanctuary, but it had never mentioned the price that sanctuary would demand. In a world where survival itself had become a privilege, they had learned that safety could be the most dangerous trap of all. The last survivors had indeed prevailed against the zombie onslaught, but their victory tasted of ashes and compromises that would haunt whatever remained of their humanity in the sterile halls of their new home.